Friends and family. This is Sharon Kyle here with my husband and co-founder of the LA Progressive, Dick Price. And today we are joined by Zayd Ayers Dohrn. And Zayd is an American playwright, screenwriter, podcaster, producer, author, professor. He's kind of everything. But the reason he's here with us today is because of his new book. It's a memoir, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent and Young. Here we go. Dangerous, Dirty, Violent and Young, a fugitive family in the revolutionary underground. And Zayd Ayers Dohrn is the son of Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers. And his memoir captures a section of his life that a lot of people are very curious about when his family was living in an underground state. He was born in San Francisco in 1977, and as many of you already know, Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers were living as fugitives because of their leadership roles in the Weather Underground. Welcome, Zayd.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. So, Dick, you want to start off with some?
Yeah, sure. So I lived through the times that your parents were active with the Weather Underground, and it was a time of great tumult. The Vietnam War was filling the streets with protesters. Civil rights movement was at its height. There was a sense in the air that revolutionary change was needed and was coming. Now, 50, 60 years later, we're in another dark time. We're entering into the third senseless war in a row. Income inequality is worse than it ever was. And racism is now being promoted from the highest levels of the countries. What do you think activists of today could learn from the experience of your parents and the Weather Underground?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope that the story I'm telling in the book will be useful to all sorts of people, certainly anybody who's interested in kind of fighting for change, trying to make a better world. I think there are notes of inspiration and notes of caution in this story, notes of inspiration around the fact that it has been a long time since we've seen in this country a really militant interracial movement of solidarity for change. I mean, one of the fascinating parts about this story is you really did have some of these groups in the Revolutionary Underground, and some of these revolutionary groups even before the Underground, who really kind of tried to band together despite government interference, despite FBI's COINTELPRO program, and really tried to find ways that they could push forward a movement of revolutionary solidarity. I'm thinking of Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, which my mom joined when she was part of SDS. And then later, when they went underground, the alliance between the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army, which was really a kind of a prototype for what it might look like for radical groups to try to build alliances, not to give up their own autonomy, but to really teach each other about how to resist in fundamental ways.
Absolutely. One of the things that I really love about your book is you touch on that, the need for and the role of multi-ethnic, multiracial alliances and the role that that played in your family's life. But then you also talk about your own personal relationship with your parents as you were going through that. And as I was reading, as a parent myself, I
Yeah.
was wondering, how did your parents feel when they read your book to hear, what you were experiencing? This was one little part where you talk about your dad. You and your dad were standing on a platform of the train, and you were pushing your dad, asking him, was there anything that you could do that would make him stop loving you? And he said,
Mm.
no, absolutely not. And then you pushed and pushed, and he said, well, if you were a racist. Can you talk a little bit
Mm.
about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of many stories in my life and in the book about my kind of growing awareness as a kid of how fundamental some of these political commitments were to my parents. And I mean, I really was growing up in a family with parents who had committed themselves to this larger movement for change. And so if they were wonderful parents, very loving, very protective of me, but also I was always aware that they had these kinds of prior promises that they had made, and really things that were fundamental to their understanding of the world that I think your average American family, your average American parents might find that strange, that there were things that they put above and beyond their commitments as parents. But For me, part of the journey of writing the book was kind of coming to understand that for my parents, there was no contradiction between being good parents and fighting for a better world, that they really felt like to be good parents, to commit to the future in any real way, they had to continue that fight because they didn't want me growing up in a world torn apart by racism and war and so on. And of course, as Dick says, we are still in that world. I'm a parent myself now, and so I'm very well aware of what it's like to raise kids when you know that the world is on fire. And so for me, part of it was just that interesting grappling with like what that did for me as a child and what now as a parent I want my own kids to understand about my commitments to that fight.
Well, I'm really interested in understanding. I've always been interested in white people that have a commitment to
Mhm.
Eradicating racism.
Yeah.
I'm always wondering, well, what motivated you? Because it's unusual. Most
Yeah.
white people in this country, whether they're people who have declared themselves racist or people who are anti-racist, they generally do
Mhm.
not invest a whole lot of time in issues of race. And so,
100% right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think for both my parents, but I focus a lot on my mother in the book because she really was somebody who you would never have expected it from her, given her upbringing. She was raised in a Republican, second generation immigrant, lower middle class house in suburban Wisconsin, kind of all American white girl. Her father was himself a racist, and so how that kid grew up to be such a militant anti-racist is really a fascinating journey. And I think you're right. Now we hear a lot about allyship and how white people should be allies in the struggle for Black liberation. I think one of the useful things about this story is that for all the Weather Underground's faults, one thing that they really were committed to and stayed committed to for their entire lives was not just to be allies, but to be comrades, to really fight alongside the forces of Black liberation. For my mother, I think one of the things I realized digging into her past was the fact that her journey of radicalization was entirely about watching friend after friend, mentor after mentor in the Black civil rights movement be killed, arrested, or exiled by white vigilantes and by the government, right? So she was drawn into the civil rights movement by Martin Luther King Jr. She marched beside him, worked with him on his rent strike as a young law student in Chicago. And then he was murdered, which really disillusioned her with the whole process of peaceful, nonviolent resistance. She joined SDS, made an alliance with Fred Hampton and the Chicago Black Panthers, felt like that was the way forward. And then he was murdered by the Chicago police. And so, you could really see her awakening as a kid raised in privilege, raised as most white middle class people in America are, an awakening to the violence behind the American system. And that for her led to a lifelong commitment to anti-racism.
So, in writing this book, I mean, certainly you loved your parents and you knew them, but here you went and did a deep dive into their lives, especially in that particular exciting time or tumultuous time. What did you learn about your parents that surprised you, and what did they do that you think we ought to be doing today?
Mhm. Well, it's funny. I mean, one thing is, I think probably like most kids, I didn't really know almost anything about my parents before the time of my birth. I mean, I had this kind of narcissistic view of my parents' lives as having more or less begun when they had me. And so to like, to dig back into their youth, and I mean, I had no idea the world in which my mother was raised, her father, her relationship with her parents, all that stuff was new to me when I started doing the research for the book. And I think, it was quite startling just in the sense that I've always known my mother as the person she eventually became, this kind of militant, radical, revolutionary, anti-racist. And so to discover the version of her who predated that, just normal, everyday, banal things. The fact that when she was in college, she tried to pledge a sorority and was rejected because she was Jewish. That was a surprise to me and something I didn't know about her background and what she, kind of what had made her feel initially like an outcast, like an outsider, and maybe some of what contributed to her lifelong solidarity with oppressed people. Those kinds of little things where you're like, I never thought of my mother as a college student or as a high school kid trying to find herself and trying to discover who she was. So that stuff was surprising. In terms of what I think we can learn from them, as I said, first of all, their lifelong, and as Sharon said, unusual commitment to being allies, comrades with the Black liberation struggle as white activists. I think that's just something we still don't see a ton of, the kind of full-throated commitment to follow the Black vanguard of the struggle and to realize the centrality of racism in the American experiment. I think that was something important. The other things, I think there's a level of right now cynicism, despair among activists, where you hear a lot of, well, I know the world is terrible, but what can we do? Well, there's a sense of passivity to it. And I think one of the reasons the Weather Underground story still fascinates people is because, for all their sometimes mistakes, these are people who really decided we cannot live with the world the way it is, and we will do anything we can to struggle against injustice. And so I think that's something we all should take seriously. I mean, I think it's right to debate tactics. I think it's right to think about what can be improved upon in that struggle. But I think that sense of we must live according to our own values. We can't be hypocrites. We have to, if we know something is wrong, we have to struggle against that. That's a real lesson for me.
Hmm. I noticed, so this is your first, your memoir, your first nonfiction book, is that right?
Yeah,
And
it
so
is, yeah.
in your other writings, which I'm unfamiliar with, does does your life experience flow into your other writings as well?
I think so. I mean, I've never addressed it directly until the last few years when I started digging into my family history. I've, as you said, been mostly a writer of fiction. I'm a playwright. I write, I invent stories. But certainly looking back, I don't think I ever thought of it consciously. But when I look back at my body of work from the last 20 years, much of my writing is about families struggling to, who have their own vision of what a better world might look like, sort of utopianism or radicalism, and how that political commitment reverberates through the domestic concerns of a family. So I see it bubbling up, I guess, in a Freudian psychoanalytical sort of way, even though as a writer, I never really tried to write about my family until now.
So you mentioned, or Sharon mentioned, that you're a parent yourself, and
Mhm.
your parent put you at some jeopardy or put you through a very difficult kind of life that was
Mhm.
potentially dangerous to you. Would you do something similar to your own kids?
I mean, I think I would, given the right circumstances. I know that the general sort of American feeling is nothing comes above keeping your kids safe, and I have, of course, a lot of sympathy with that view, given that I would do anything for my daughters and do feel that they are the central commitment in my life. At the same time, I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that many people have commitments that they are willing to risk everything for. I mean, in this country, for example, it's just taken for granted that military families, for example, they might risk their lives and leave their kids behind in the service of this larger project, right? Or police families or firefighter families where people are taking great risks, and we accept that because we understand that they supposedly anyway are doing something for the greater good. I think that, for all of us, we and maybe now is a time when especially we should be thinking about what are the things that matter most to us. What are the struggles we're willing to risk something for? I mean, I hope not to be in a situation where I would have to risk my family or risk
Mhm.
my children or those kinds of things. But I think if you're serious about trying to make the world better, if you're serious about resisting injustice when it rears its head, I mean, I think sometimes about what would it look like to be um, in Germany during the rise of fascism, or in America during chattel slavery, and like how far would any of us be willing to go to resist what we now all accept was grave, grave, grave injustice? And so I think I hope that we can in this country make change peacefully, democratically, but I also think there are times in history when things reach a point where everybody has to decide where they stand and has to risk a lot for, for that fight.
So during the 60s, we're talking about passivity and concern and lack of action today. During the 60s, I mean, there was a lot of, I mean, people were in the streets, people were taking over college buildings, people were doing lots of stuff. I mean, they weren't passive, they were very
Yeah,
concerned. And I
yeah.
see what you do. I mean, we operate, and probably you do, in circles of people who are deeply concerned, but they aren't as broadly spread. And
Mhm.
what do you think can ignite people to make real change in the country?
Mm. I mean, I think it depends on your definition of broadly spread. And what I mean by that is certainly it's true. Of course, we all know, for example, that in the 60s, certain things like the draft or the struggle for, universal suffrage, those were things that united a lot of people because they impacted people directly. And I think one of the successes that the forces of injustice have had over the past decades has been making people feel that these issues did not affect us personally and therefore making people more passive. That being said, I mean, I think it's very possible that people will look back at this current moment and say, that the resistance movement was very broad based, that many people took part in it. And, some of the protests that have happened recently, the Women's March, the protests against ICE, the Black Lives Matter marches, those by some measures were some of the largest protest movements in this country's history. And so it's not that people aren't standing up and being counted and saying, I oppose this. It's that we have not yet had success in changing the trajectory of the country. So I think a lot depends on these next 2, 4, 10 years and what happens. But I think we may well look back at this time as a time of great and vibrant activism, because a lot is happening, even though it's easy to fall into despair and say, well, things are just getting worse, but that was true in the 60s too. I mean, I'll tell you one thing that was kind of a revelation for me in the research of this book. We now look back at groups like the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, my mother's trajectory, and we think of these people as people who sort of sprang fully formed into radicalism. But in 1969, my mother had been protesting almost her entire adult life for the entirety of the 1960s, leading anti-war marches, leading voter registration drives, trying to, protest and be-ins and sit-ins and all these things. So these were young people who had spent the better part of a decade protesting, and yet things were getting worse in 1969, right? The repression of the Black movement was getting worse, more violent. The Vietnam War was escalating. And I think a lot of people in that period, 1969, 1970, turned towards radicalism because it felt like all those attempts at peaceful democratic change had failed. And so I don't know, I look at our current moment and I think we're now in year 10 of the Trump era, and people have tried almost everything they can think of to resist this. And the fact that it still feels ineffectual, that we still keep losing, that the country doesn't seem willing to pull itself out of that spiral, can lead either to despair or it can lead to a new kind of progressive radicalism, which is, I think, what you're seeing in some of the most recent elections, the DSA, Mamdani, et cetera. I think you're seeing people just really looking for a new model of what this country could be. And that can be exciting.
Yes, yes. When I was there in that era, so these are sort of my preteen years, and term radical, I always kind of rejected it, and still, to some extent, I still reject it. My parents and I would get into these heated arguments because they would call me radical because I refused to straighten my hair and
Yeah,
insisted on wearing a big afro. So they said, we don't want people to think that you're a radical, that you're one of these Black radicals. What does it mean to be radical? I don't want the straightening comb to burn my scalp. Is that what radical means? So
right. That's funny. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I want you to define for me what you mean by radical, because
Yeah.
different people, they hear the term and we don't all mean the same thing when we use
I
that.
completely agree. I completely agree. It's an elastic term that it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. It can be a pejorative term, or it can be something that people self-identify with. Of course, my parents would always call themselves radicals, and in fact, if anybody ever called them liberals or progressives, they would be insulted by it, and they would, we're not liberals, we're radicals. And what they meant, I think, the word radical comes from the Latin radix, which means root. And the idea is to dig at the roots of things, to address root problems, and not to sort of like, adjust the drapes as the Titanic is going down, but to really think about like what is causing the heart of our problems. So in that sense, I identify as a radical. I think like some of my basic views that, well, let me put it this way. You say the basic tenets of what passes for a radical belief in America, and it shouldn't be radical at all. Like, for example, I believe in equality for people of color and reparations for the descendants of slavery and indigenous people who had their land stolen. That's a radical belief in America, but it doesn't seem to me that it should be that radical. I mean, it seems fairly common sense to me. In other ways, the radicalism, my parents' brand of radicalism has been associated with kind of violent resistance, what it looks like to go from kind of participating in the democratic process to moving outside of it. For me, that's contextual. I can understand why they made the choices they made, given the repression that the movement was facing at that time from the FBI, et cetera. But I'm by nature and by temperament, I'm a writer and an intellectual, not a revolutionary activist, but I consider my beliefs radical. So it really depends where you're drawing those lines.
Well, it's helpful, especially in you giving the root of the word. That is helpful.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
let's move on. So is this memoir ultimately an act of reconciliation, indictment, inheritance? How would you capture this in a single word,
Yeah.
a couple of
You
words?
mean in terms of my relationship to my parents?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's an act of it's what it really is an act of history telling, of storytelling, and of me
Uh-oh.
estranged. I mean, they were good parents. We always have had a good relationship. So I don't think we need a reconciliation. I also don't think it's an indictment because I don't feel critical of my parents' root choices. I feel like I have things to say about their legacy. I feel like for me, what the book really is an act of taking my own inheritance and trying to transform it for my kids and make meaning of our family story and our country's story to pass it on and hopefully make it useful for the next generation.
And speaking of your kids, how did they receive this book? I'm sure that there's a lot in the book that they never knew.
There's a lot in the book that they never knew, and I'm really grateful that both of my daughters read the book. They're teenagers and young adults, and I wasn't sure they'd be interested in their old family history, but they both read it, and I think it definitely has changed the way they see her.
You froze there for a minute, so
Oh,
but that we can cut that part out. But I'm glad that both of your daughters have read it, and now they have a deeper understanding of their grandparents and their father.
they definitely do. Yes, and of their father, exactly.
So what's your new project? What you working on now?
I'm working on a couple things. I have a play that I wrote. It's kind of a punk rock hip hop musical that I wrote with Tom Morello, the guitarist from Rage Against the Machine, who's a great activist and musician. And we did a production of it here in Chicago last October, and we're bringing it to New York this year. So I'm working on the next version of that. I'm working on a novel that is kind of adjacent to the world of the memoir, and so I'm thinking about my next writing project, and I'm sending my daughter off to college. So that's
cool.
That's so exciting. No worries. We were just saying goodbye to everyone, thanking you for spending some time with us, encouraging them to get the book, Dangerous, Dirty, and Violent and Young by Zayd Ayers Dohrn. And it's a great, great read. And I'm going to delve back into it. It's bringing back a lot of memories from my childhood. And there are a lot of great photos in the books, sprinkled throughout the book, which I really appreciate.
Thank you, Zayd. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It's been really fun talking to you.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.